She arrived in New York on the 12th of September 1922, draped in a white fox fur coat, accompanied by a maid, a secretary, a personal physician, and enough luggage to fill a railway car. No one had told her to do this. No studio had arranged it. No publicist had scripted it. She had simply decided, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had been making decisions since she was a child in Warsaw with nothing, that when Pola Negri arrived in America for the first time, America would know about it. America knew about it. The press that met her at the dock described her arrival as one of the most theatrical entrances a film star had ever made. And this was a city that had been greeting film stars for nearly a decade. She was 25 years old. She had survived a father's deportation to Siberia, tuberculosis in a sanatorium in the mountains, 2 world wars, a revolution, and the collapse of the German economy. She had been a countess. She had been a pauper. She had been the most celebrated actress in Europe and was about to become the most famous foreign woman in the history of American silent film. And none of that, none of the surviving, none of the achieving, none of the remaking herself across continents and languages and collapsing political orders, none of it was the thing that history would remember most clearly. History would remember the funeral. History would remember the flowers on the coffin, arranged to spell a single word in white blossoms against $2,000 worth of blood-red roses. History would remember the fainting, and the sobbing, and the black veil, and the question that never went away. Was any of it real? Her name was Barbara Apollonia Chaupiec. She invented herself so completely that almost nobody alive today remembers that name. She became Pola Negri in a tuberculosis sanatorium at the age of 14, lying in a bed in the mountains of southern Poland, deciding that if she was going to survive this, she was going to survive it as someone else. Someone for whom the worst had already happened and could not happen again. This is the story of who that someone else actually was. The city of Lipno is a small market town in the Kuyavian-Pomeranian region of what is now northern Poland. In January of 1897, when Barbara Apollonia Chaupiec was born there, it was part of the Russian Empire, a partitioned territory without independent statehood, governed from St. Petersburg, occupied by a power that had spent a century systematically suppressing Polish language, Polish culture, and Polish political aspiration. Her father was Juraj Chaupiec, a Slovak tinsmith by trade who had come to Poland and stayed. He was not a man of means or standing. He was a craftsman, skilled with his hands, unreliable in his political judgment, possessed of a conviction about Polish independence that would cost his family everything. Her mother, Eleonora Kiełczewska, came from what Pola would later describe as impoverished Polish nobility, a family that had once had position and had lost it over generations in the economic and political upheavals of a country that had been carved up between empires. Eleonora was a woman who had learned, early and thoroughly, how to make very little serve a great many purposes. She would spend the rest of her life demonstrating this skill. Pola was the only one of 3 children to survive infancy. She was 5 years old, possibly younger, when her father was arrested by the Russian authorities. The charge, by multiple accounts, was involvement in revolutionary activities, specifically advocacy for Polish independence from Russian rule. The punishment was deportation to Siberia. He was put on a train heading east. He would die in Siberia. He never came back. The government, by Pola's later account, confiscated the family's belongings. Whether they also burned the house, a detail that appears in some accounts but not in others, is less clear than what is certain, that Eleonora Chaupiec and her young daughter were left with nothing. Nothing except each other, and the road to Warsaw and whatever Eleonora could construct out of the wreckage of what remained. She got them to Warsaw. She found work as a cook. She found an apartment in the poorer quarter of the city, in the specific poverty of people who have known something better and are daily reminded of the distance between what they had and what they now have. Pola, who was perhaps 6 years old and perhaps 8, the accounts differ, grew up in this apartment. She grew up without a father, with a mother who worked in other people's kitchens, in a city governed by an empire that did not want her people to exist in the form they had chosen for themselves. There is a particular quality to the ambition that rose from this specific combination: early loss, reduced circumstances, a mother who has proven it is possible to survive almost anything, a world that is indifferent to your survival and must therefore be persuaded to pay attention by whatever means are available. Pola paid attention to dance. She had been watching professional dancers in Warsaw since she was old enough to find her way to the theater without supervision. She had been imitating what she saw since before she had the vocabulary to describe it. By the time she was 12, she had decided she was going to be a ballerina, not wanted to be, was going to be. She auditioned for Warsaw's Imperial Ballet Academy. She was accepted. She danced her first performance in the chorus of Baby Swans in Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, a detail she would return to in interviews and memoirs across the following 60 years, with a consistency that suggests it was not a detail she was ever entirely free from. She worked her way up to a solo role in Coppelia. She was on a trajectory that, in the normal course of events, would have taken her through the ranks of the corps and eventually, if the talent held and the ambition held and the body held, to soloist status, to principal, to the thing she had decided she was going to be. Then the tuberculosis arrived. It came the way it always came, quietly, with symptoms that were easy to dismiss until they were not. A cough that deepened into something more insistent, a fatigue that did not lift with rest. She was sent to a sanatorium in Zakopane, in the Tatra Mountains of southern Poland, where the air was clean and the treatments were rest and time and hope. She lay in a bed in the mountains. She was 14 years old. Her dancing career was over. The thing she had organized her entire childhood around was gone, and she was in a sanatorium bed trying to breathe. And she had the particular quantity of time that sick people in sanatoriums have, time uninterrupted by obligation, time that has no useful structure, time in which a 14-year-old girl could either deteriorate quietly or decide who she was going to be instead. She decided. She had been reading the work of an Italian poet named Ada Negri, a writer whose work dealt in strong women, endurance, the dignity of labor and survival. The name appealed to her. She took it as her stage name. Pola, the diminutive of Apollonia. Negri, for the Italian poet whose work she read in a mountain sanatorium while her lungs healed. Barbara Apollonia Chaupiec recovered from tuberculosis. The girl who walked out of that sanatorium and back down toward Warsaw was Pola Negri. She applied to the Imperial Academy of Dramatic Arts in Warsaw under her new name. She was 14 and the minimum age for admission was 17. She lied about her age. She was admitted. Her graduation performance earned her offers from 3 major theater companies. She accepted the most ambitious one and spent the following years building a reputation on the Warsaw stage with a speed that suggests she had, in fact, transferred the ferocity she had directed at ballet into something that suited her better, a form in which the performer's entire self, not just the trained body, was the instrument. She was not merely talented. She was electric in the specific way that a small number of performers in every generation are electric, the way that makes audiences understand, within moments of the curtain rising, that the night is going to be different because of this specific person on stage. In 1913, director Max Reinhardt came to Warsaw to see her perform in Sumuren, a wordless pantomime production that had originated in Berlin. He invited her to Berlin to appear in his German revival. She went to her. Berlin in 1916 was a city doing what cities do under the pressure of a war that is consuming their young men at industrial scale, finding entertainment, finding distraction, finding any available channel for the feelings that daily life had no room for. The film industry was flourishing precisely because reality had become intolerable and screens were offering something else. In Berlin, through Reinhardt's production, she met Ernst Lubitsch. Lubitsch was a German-Jewish filmmaker of considerable wit and instinct who had been making comedies for the UFA studio and who saw in Pola Negri something that the comedy format he had been working in could not use, a raw, dark, animal seriousness that was absolutely right for tragedy. He convinced UFA to let him make something larger and more ambitious with Negri as the lead. The result, in 1918, was The Eyes of the Mummy Ma, a film that established both of them in the first tier of German cinema and that launched a series of Lubitsch-Negri collaborations, each one larger and darker and more technically accomplished than the previous one. Their masterwork was Madame du Barry, released in 1919, in which Negri played the courtesan who rose to become the favorite mistress of Louis XV, and who was eventually sent to the guillotine by the Revolution. The film was an international sensation. Jesse Lasky, who ran Paramount Pictures in America, saw the Berlin premiere and made a decision on the spot. He wanted her in Hollywood. It took 3 years to arrange. By the time she boarded the ship for New York in September of 1922, she had been the most celebrated actress in Germany, had been briefly married to a Polish count named Eugene Damski. The marriage had lasted officially from 1919 to 1922, though by multiple accounts the separation had begun considerably earlier, and had earned and spent and reinvented herself more times than the biographies that would follow her could easily track. She arrived in New York in the white fox fur coat with the maid and the secretary and the physician and the luggage. Paramount Pictures had contracted her for $3,000 a week, a figure that the press printed with the kind of emphasis that made clear it was intended to be impressive. It was impressive. She was 25 years old and had been born in a Russian-occupied market town to a woman who worked as a cook. Hollywood in 1922 was a city that had been manufacturing dreams for barely a decade, and had already developed all the pathologies of a place where the distance between nobodies and somebodies can be crossed in a single film and uncrossed just as quickly. Pola Negri did not fit into Hollywood. She did not try to fit into Hollywood. She moved into a mansion she described as modeled after the White House. She walked her pet cheetah through the streets of Los Angeles on a steel chain leash. She wore turbans. She popularized red nail polish at a time when the convention for women of standing was colorless. She referred to herself in interviews and in conversation as Madame Negri, and if people found this pretentious, she appeared not to notice, or to notice and to find the objection uninteresting. She had met Charlie Chaplin briefly in Berlin in September of 1921, when he was on his first visit to Germany and was still unknown there. German audiences had not yet seen his films. Their actual relationship began when she arrived in Hollywood in late 1922, and they were reintroduced through the social world that the studio system had created around itself. Charlie Chaplin was 33 years old. He was the most famous man in the world. He was also, by the account of every person who knew him well enough to speak plainly about it, a man whose personal conduct toward women had been generating private concern for years, concern that would not become public catastrophe until considerably later, but that was already well established in the circles that counted. He had been married twice. Both marriages had ended badly. He was living alone in a large house in Beverly Hills, and he was, when he met Pola Negri properly at the end of 1922, immediately consumed. The press, which had been given access to virtually every development in the relationship by two performers who understood that publicity was not a side effect of fame, but a fuel for it, covered the affair with the devotion usually reserved for wars and elections. The Los Angeles Times would later describe it as Miss Negri's most tempestuous romance, covered from start to finish by the press, which at one point camped in her living room when Chaplin refused to leave the house after a quarrel. On Christmas Eve of 1922, Chaplin gave her a large diamond. He intended it to become an engagement ring. On the 28th of January 1923, they held a press conference at which they formally announced their engagement. Photographers captured them together. The story ran in every newspaper that covered entertainment. On the 2nd of March 1923, less than 5 weeks later, Chaplin announced to the newspapers that he was too poor to get married. Pola Negri's response was delivered to the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner with a directness that the paper found quotable enough to use as its headline, "Pola Negri jilts Chaplin." She said, "I end just like that. I am very extreme." She told the Examiner, "He is too temperamental, as changing as the wind. He dramatizes everything. He experiments in love." Chaplin, who had told the press he was too poor to marry, was worth an estimated $12 million at the time of this statement. What followed over the next several months was the specific torture of a relationship conducted entirely in public by two people who were too proud to simply walk away and too aware of the audience to forget it was watching. They broke up. They reconciled. They broke up again. The press covered each development with equal enthusiasm. By the 28th of June, 1923, when the final break was announced, the Chaplin-Negri engagement had generated more newspaper coverage than most foreign policy events of the same period. Chaplin's actual response to Pola's declaration that he experimented in love was not recorded. He moved on to other women. The pattern was well established by then and would continue for another 3 decades. Pola moved on to other men. She moved on, specifically, to Rudolph Valentino. They met at a costume party held by Marion Davies and William Randolph Hearst at the San Simeon Estate, one of the most famous private properties in California, a castle built by the most powerful newspaper publisher in America on a hill overlooking the Pacific, and the site of the party that would change both their lives. Valentino came dressed as the bullfighter from his film Blood and Sand. Pola came as an officer of the guard for Catherine the Great. Someone introduced them. According to the account she gave in interviews and in her memoirs, sparks flew immediately, an evening rendezvous was arranged, and love was born. This account is offered in the full awareness that Pola Negri's account of her own love life was never the account most governed by the standard definitions of factual accuracy. She was a performer. The story of her life was a performance. The performance was often more interesting than anything the unadorned facts could have produced. And the unadorned facts were themselves extraordinary. What is documented beyond dispute? From some time in 1926, Pola Negri and Rudolph Valentino were seen together constantly. They were photographed together at the wedding of Mae Murray to Prince David Medivani in Hollywood in 1926, both of them laughing in candid shots that biographers have returned to repeatedly because they show something genuinely unusual. 2 famous people in a public setting who appear to be enjoying themselves rather than managing their image. Valentino was 31 years old. He was the biggest male star in Hollywood, the Latin lover, the man who had made the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse and The Sheik and Blood and Sand, and had been creating in American women audiences a response so unambiguous that newspaper columnists had begun writing about it with the slightly alarmed tone of people who were not sure it was entirely appropriate. He was also, by his own account, genuinely in love with Pola. He cooked for her. His friend Beulah Livingston remembered Valentino preparing for Pola a dish he had invented and named eggs polonaise, a scrambled egg preparation with corn and tomatoes and peppers and garlic that Livingston remembered with the specific detail that people remember things that belong to a happiness that did not last. They were publicly reported as engaged. Whether they were actually engaged is the first of several facts about Valentino and Pola Negri that the historical record declines to confirm. Pola said they were. Valentino never publicly confirmed or denied it. His companion in New York in the days before his collapse, a Follies girl named Marion Benda, said afterward that Valentino had no intention of remarrying and that the statements about an engagement had all come from her. She was, Benda noted, with the particular economy of someone who had watched Pola operate at close range, not sure he would have denied it. On the 15th of August, 1926, Rudolph Valentino collapsed in New York. He was operated on for appendicitis and a perforated ulcer. He seemed, in the days after the operation, to be recovering. Then infection set in, then a coma. On the 23rd of August, 1926, Rudolph Valentino died. He was 31 years old. Pola Negri was in Hollywood when she heard. She collapsed. She recovered. She packed. She boarded a train for New York. She was accompanied by a maid, a secretary, and, this is a detail that has become central to the subsequent argument about what happened next, her press agent. Tens of thousands of people were already gathered outside the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Home on Broadway and 66th Street. The crowd stretched for 11 blocks. Windows had been smashed. Police had been called. 2 fans, by the later accounts, had committed suicide upon hearing the news of Valentino's death. The scale of public grief was, by any contemporary measurement, without precedent in the history of American celebrity. Pola Negri arrived. She was dressed in $3,000 worth of black fabric. She was draped in flowing black veils. She was supported by bodyguards. She announced to reporters on the steps outside the funeral home that she and Valentino had been secretly engaged to be married. She posed dramatically for the photographers. She then threw herself across the open casket, sobbing and fainting simultaneously, and incited the enormous crowd of mourners, already at a barely controlled emotional pitch to riot, breaking the windows of the funeral home, fighting with police, storming the entrance. The body was shipped from New York to Hollywood by train for a second funeral. Pola accompanied it. The train stopped at major cities between the coasts, Chicago, Kansas City, Denver, and at each stop she willingly emerged to repeat her grief routine for the reporters who were waiting. She fainted. She sobbed. She gave statements. She answered questions. At the Hollywood funeral at the Church of the Good Shepherd on the 14th of September, she had arranged at a cost of $2,000 a bed of blood-red roses with her name spelled out in white blossoms at the center, P-O-L-A. She fainted again. She sobbed again. She wore $13,000 worth of black. The press, which had been Pola Negri's most reliable collaborator across her entire career, turned on her. The verdict that emerged in the days and weeks after the funeral, and that would follow Pola Negri for the rest of her career, shaping the narrative of her downfall in America, was delivered with the specific cruelty of an audience that feels it has been manipulated. She was accused of performing her grief, of using a dead man's funeral as a publicity vehicle, of the most cynical kind of self-promotion, dressed in borrowed mourning. Malicious tongues, the biographers noted, described the funeral as her best performance. Whether any of it was real, whether the love was real, whether the engagement was real, whether the grief was real, or whether the entire elaborate performance was exactly that, a performance, calculated and executed with the same professional precision she brought to everything else, is a question that the surviving evidence refuses to answer definitively. What is certain is this: Pola Negri said, for the rest of her life, that Valentino was the greatest love she had ever known. She said it to journalists. She said it in her autobiography. She said it in her final years in San Antonio. Whether she was telling the truth or performing the truth, or whether for Pola Negri those two things were ultimately the same, this is the question at the center of her life, and it does not have a clean answer. 6 months after Rudolph Valentino's funeral, Pola Negri married Prince Serge Medivani. The prince was Georgian by birth and self-styled by title. The family's claim to actual nobility was, at best, disputed and, at worst, an elaborate social invention that the Medivani brothers had constructed with considerable skill and used with considerable success across the American and European social worlds of the 1920s. The brothers had a system. They were handsome. They had a family name that sounded like royalty, and they married women who were rich or famous, or both. Serge Medivani's brother David had married Mae Murray, the actress, in 1926, the same ceremony at which Pola and Valentino had been photographed laughing together. Marrying Serge Medivani made Pola Negri the sister-in-law of her professional rival. This was not, by any available account, something Pola had failed to notice. The American public had not forgiven Pola for the funeral. The marriage, which happened less than 6 months after the funeral, did not help. The message it sent, that the woman who had declared Valentino the greatest love of her life had recovered sufficiently from this devastating loss to enter a new marriage within half a year, was received with the kind of audience displeasure that has always been most dangerous in the entertainment industry. Not active hostility, but simple disengagement. Paramount, which had been paying her $10,000 a week at the height of her American career, cut her salary. The film she made in the late 1920s performed less well than the films she had made earlier in the decade. The public that had loved the exotic vamp was drifting towards something different, and the transition to sound was about to make the question of where Pola Negri fit in American cinema considerably more acute. Her Polish accent, which had been irrelevant in the silent era, was now a practical problem of the first order. The voice that played beautifully in the drawing rooms and stages of Warsaw and Berlin did not translate into the particular register that American talkies required, a register that was, by the mid-1920s, so thoroughly Anglo-American in its expectations that even the German and Swedish accents of performers considerably more established than Pola Negri were creating difficulties. Garbo had survived. Dietrich had survived. Neither of them had also survived the Valentino funeral. Pola Negri left Hollywood in 1928. Her marriage to Medivani was dissolving. It would be finalized in divorce in 1931. She went back to Europe, where she still had audiences who remembered what she could do and were not preoccupied with what she had done at a funeral. She made a French film in 1934, fanatisme, that received favorable notices. She signed with UFA, the German film studio, in 1935, the same studio that had launched her international career in 1918, now operating under the control of Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda ministry. Her first film for the reconstituted UFA was Mazurka, a melodrama about mother love. It was considered artistically valuable by the Reichsfilmkammer, the Nazi film chamber. It was a commercial success, and it became, according to multiple documented accounts, one of Adolf Hitler's favorite films. The detail that Hitler had named Mazurka one of his preferred films was the kind of detail that, in the political atmosphere of 1937, could destroy a career or end a life, depending on which direction it cut. For Pola Negri, it cut in a direction she had not anticipated. A French magazine called Pour Vous published a report claiming that Pola Negri had been conducting a romantic affair with Adolf Hitler. This was false. There is no documented evidence of any relationship between Pola Negri and Adolf Hitler beyond the existence of his documented film preferences. Pola, in her autobiography, addressed the rumor with the particular exhausted clarity of a woman who had been dealing with invented stories about herself for 30 years. I was no more responsible for the fact that I happened to be Hitler's favorite movie star than I was for the crimes committed by the inmates of Alcatraz, who had once voted me their favorite star. She sued Pour Vous for libel. She won. The more pressing problem was what Goebbels was doing. Having established her presence in the German film industry, Goebbels now wanted her to make Nazi propaganda films. She refused. Then the Nazi apparatus found a different angle. They announced that Pola Negri was Jewish. The accusation, in Germany in 1938, was not a description. It was a threat. She was neither Jewish nor safe. She left Germany with the methodical speed of someone who understood exactly what leaving and not leaving would respectively mean. She went to France. When Germany occupied France, she went to Portugal. In 1941, she sailed from Lisbon to New York. When the ship arrived, she was detained at Ellis Island while authorities processed her papers. The woman who had arrived in New York 19 years earlier in a white fox fur coat with a private physician and a railroad car full of luggage arrived this time as a refugee. She was 44 years old. She was, by her own later account, nearly penniless. The war had consumed her European fortune with the thoroughness that wars consume everything. She got off the boat. She started again. Hollywood in 1941 was not the Hollywood of 1922. The studio system was still intact, but the world it had been built to serve had changed in ways that could not be entirely compensated for by talent or determination or the remnants of a European reputation. She made one film in America after the war, Hi Diddle Diddle, in 1943, a comedy with Adolphe Menjou that did modest business and returned her to the screen without returning her to the conversation that mattered. And then came the offer. In 1948, the director Billy Wilder was developing a film called Sunset Boulevard, a story about a silent film star, Norma Desmond, who has been forgotten by an industry that once worshipped her and who is living in a decaying mansion with the grandeur and the madness of someone who cannot accept that her time has passed. He approached Pola Negri for the role. She was appalled. She told Wilder that she was not a has-been. She told him the screenplay was not ready. She told him she found the role insulting. She declined. Mae West also declined. Greta Garbo declined. Mary Pickford declined. Norma Shearer declined. The role eventually went to Gloria Swanson, who won the Academy Award nomination that the role deserved and became, through her performance, permanently identified with the material. The irony that Pola Negri, the original vamp, the first European star imported to Hollywood, the woman who had walked her cheetah through Los Angeles and refused to acknowledge that she was anything less than Madame Negri, had been offered and declined the defining role about the tragedy of the forgotten silent film star, is one that subsequent critics have not been able to resist pointing out. She was not Norma Desmond. She refused, with her entire self, to be Norma Desmond. Whether this refusal was a form of dignity or a form of denial is a question that does not have a simple answer, and possibly does not have any answer. In the early 1940s, Pola Negri became close friends with a woman named Margaret West. Margaret West was a Texas oil heiress, a former radio performer and vaudeville actress, and a woman of considerable independent means. She had met Pola in the 1930s, and when Pola returned from Europe in 1941, West was one of the people who helped her re-establish herself in Los Angeles. The two women became housemates. They shared a beach house in Los Angeles with Pola's mother, who was by then in her late 80s. After Eleonora Chaupiec died in 1954 of pancreatic cancer, having survived in roughly this order the deportation of her husband to Siberia, 2 world wars, the collapse of 3 European empires, and the specific difficulties of being the mother of Pola Negri. Pola and Margaret West moved to San Antonio, Texas. They lived together in San Antonio from 1957 until Margaret West's death in 1963. First in a suite at the Menger Hotel, then in a large house in the affluent Olmos Park neighborhood. West left Pola a substantial portion of her estate, which meant that the woman who had arrived in New York as a refugee in 1941 spent her final decades in genuine comfort, if not in the extravagance of her Hollywood peak. The nature of the relationship between Pola Negri and Margaret West is the subject of a persistent historical discussion that Pola herself addressed in her autobiography, with a sentence that reads like a very careful statement made by a very careful woman. It is difficult for the so-called sophisticates to understand that there had not been until then, nor would there ever be in the future, the slightest tinge of the sexual to what we shared together. Some scholars, including Rudolph Valentino's biographer Emily Leiter, have suggested that Negri was bisexual and that the relationship with West was a romantic partnership. Pola's biographer, Sergio Delgado, while contesting this conclusion, acknowledged in his 2016 book that there is strong anecdotal evidence that Negri was bisexual. The actress Tallulah Bankhead, who was not known for generosity toward rivals, described Pola to interviewers as a lying lesbo, a statement that was at the time intended as an insult and that reads now as a document of its own historical moment, telling you more about Bankhead and the era than it tells you about Pola. What the surviving evidence actually supports is this. Pola Negri spent the last 20 years of her adult life in a domestic arrangement with a woman. She declined to describe that arrangement in terms that would have resolved the question. She spent her career orchestrating love stories for public consumption, Chaplin, Valentino, Medivani, while whatever private life existed, and behind the performance remained, to the end, private. This was, in its way, the most complete victory she had ever achieved over the press that had followed her since 1922. They had camped in her living room during the Chaplin affair. They had printed every sob and every faint at the Valentino funeral. They had published the Hitler rumor and the Pourvu Libelle suit, and every breakdown and every comeback across 40 years of coverage. And the thing they most wanted to know, the one question at the center of everything, they never got the answer to. Pola Negri made one final film. In 1964, she appeared in Walt Disney's The Moonspinners, a family adventure film set in Crete starring Hayley Mills. The role she played was Madame Habib, an eccentric jewel collector. She was 67 years old. She filmed her scenes in London, where she had not worked since the 1920s. She arrived at her hotel accompanied by a cheetah from the film, a different cheetah from the one she had walked in Los Angeles in the 1920s, but a cheetah nonetheless, on a steel chain leash, and she walked it through the lobby of the hotel for the benefit of the London press corps that had gathered to document her return. She was 67 years old, and she was still performing. She returned to San Antonio. She served on the boards of the San Antonio Symphony Orchestra and the San Antonio Little Theater. She worked on her autobiography, which was published by Doubleday in 1970 under the title Memoirs of a Star. She appeared at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in April of 1970 for a screening of her 1925 film A Woman of the World, and the audience's reception, by every account, was the kind that people who love film give to someone who made the form what it is when it was still being invented. In 1978, Billy Wilder, the same Billy Wilder who had offered her Sunset Boulevard 30 years earlier, directed a film called Fedora. The title character of Fedora, an aging, silent film star who cannot let go of the persona that made her, was reported by multiple sources to have been based largely on Pola Negri. She did not appear in the film. She was not asked to. The character was played by someone else. In 1980, Life magazine ran a feature called Where Are They Now? On surviving silent film stars. Pola Negri was among them. She was 83 years old. The photograph showed a woman who had not become the thing the magazine title implied, someone misplaced, forgotten, faded. She looked like exactly what she had always been, a person who had decided, a very long time ago in a sanatorium in the mountains of southern Poland, who she was going to be, and who had never found a compelling reason to change that decision. She had a brain tumor. She had refused treatment for 2 years. In the summer of 1987, the tumor produced complications that required hospitalization. She developed pneumonia in the hospital. On the 1st of August, 1987, Pola Negri died at Northeast Baptist Hospital in San Antonio, Texas. She was 90 years old. She was buried in a yellow golden chiffon dress with a golo, a turban to match, because of course she was, at Calvary Cemetery in East Los Angeles, next to her mother. The woman who had cooked in other people's kitchens in Warsaw to keep them both alive was buried beside the woman who had become the first European actress to be contracted to a major Hollywood studio. She had no children and no siblings. She left most of her estate to St. Mary's University in San Antonio, including her memorabilia and several rare prints of her early films. She left a portion to the Polish nuns of the Seraphic Order. The university established a scholarship in her name. A large black and white portrait of her hangs in the small chapel there, next to Poland's patron, Our Lady of Częstochowa. There is a version of Pola Negri's story that reduces her to the funeral. The sobbing, the fainting, the flowers spelling her own name across her dead lover's coffin. These images have persisted in the cultural memory with the particular tenacity of images that contain something unresolvable at their center. Was she performing? Was she grieving? Was there, for Pola Negri, any meaningful distinction between those two things? The fuller account begins with the Russian Empire deporting her father to Siberia and the government burning or confiscating everything her family owned, and a woman named Eleonora Chaupiec taking her daughter to Warsaw and finding work as a cook. It includes a girl accepting the loss of ballet with the pragmatism of someone who had already lost more important things, lying in a sanatorium bed, renaming herself after an Italian poet, and walking back down the mountain as someone new. It includes a theatrical career in Warsaw, a film career in Berlin, an ocean crossing in a white fox fur coat, a decade at the top of the most powerful entertainment industry in the world, 2 marriages, the most famous funeral performance in the history of celebrity grief, an accusation of having an affair with Adolf Hitler, a libel suit that she won, a refugee crossing from Lisbon, and a final act in San Antonio, Texas, with a woman whose precise relationship to her she never fully disclosed, tending Catholic charities, and serving on the board of the symphony orchestra. The flowers that spelled Pola were the most honest thing about her. They were also the most characteristic. She had been spelling her name in public since she was 14 years old and had decided in a tuberculosis sanatorium that the name she had been born with was not adequate to what she intended to become. Every scandal, every affair, every fainting spell, every cheetah on a leash, all of it was the same act, performed in different registers across 7 decades. Pola Negri, insisting on being known, on being seen, on being impossible to ignore. Whether the love affairs were real, whether the grief was genuine, whether the woman behind the performance was the same as the performance, these are questions that she went to her grave having successfully declined to answer. What she could not decline to answer was what? The work showed. The film she made with Lubitsch in Germany, the Hollywood pictures at her peak, the final appearance in The Moonspinners at 67, they show a performer of complete technical authority and considerable emotional intelligence, a woman who understood the camera with an intimacy that the best silent film performers developed because the camera was the only instrument they had, and they had to master it completely. She was also the first, before Garbo, before Dietrich, before any of the European actresses whose names the 20th century kept. Pola Negri arrived in New York in September of 1922 in a white fox fur coat and proved that the ocean was crossable and the American audience was reachable, and the thing she had become in Warsaw and Berlin could translate into something that mattered on the other side of the world. She opened the door. The flowers on the coffin were just how she signed her name. If Pola Negri's story stayed with you, subscribe to Silk and Sorrow. These are the women whose private lives the public was never meant to fully understand, and whose performances, on screen and off, were sometimes impossible to separate from the truth. Next week, Marion Davies, the woman William Randolph Hearst spent the equivalent of $150 million promoting, who watched him build a castle for her while remaining married to someone else, and who descended into alcoholism in a hilltop palace while Hollywood slowly forgot she had ever been funny. The woman behind the myth of Citizen Kane is next.